think a few still joining. It might be worth giving them another minute or two.
Okay. I think I'm going to start because there's no one else joining now. So I'm going to talk about Sass, which is syntactically awesome style sheets. It's a pre-processor scripting language that is interpreted or compiled into cascading style sheets known as CSS. Oh, more people joining. So because style sheets within projects can get really large and messy over time, making them harder to maintain, we use Sass. So some of the features that I will go through later on is variables, nestings, mixins, and inheritance. So we actually use a 7-to-1 architecture pattern. So this is where we store partials inside of 7 folders and are imported into the main CSS file for compiling. The actual partial naming convention is underscore and then the name of the partial. These are your 7 folders: base, components, layout, pages, themes, abstracts, and vendor extensions, which I will explain what's expected to be under each one. So this image is from the Sass documentation, and it does sum up Sass quite well because we only rely on one file to compile all the partials. So within the base folder, we've got the general styles that are used throughout the app. So you've got your reset, helpers, and typography. Abstracts is where we store any variables, mixins, and I'll go into more details about mixins later. The components folder is, for example, alerts, cards, chips, lists, and tables. They're generally global styles, for example. So the info list that you see where every other row is on a grey background, the styles for that are under components within lists. The layout folder contains the styles for the top level layout template, including title, subtitle, and side nav. Pages, so this is if you have a particular component that has its own styles. So the best example of this is US core. So on there, the comparable grid has its own dedicated style sheet under the pages folder. And then of course the naming is relevant to the actual component. The themes folder is where the default color palettes are for the app and material components. So that's where you'll set the primary and the accent color. Vendor extensions is probably the most used one. So this is where we actually override third-party libraries. So the main one you'll probably be in and out of is the material components override. Okay, so this is some of the features that Sass actually gives you over CSS. So nesting is probably the most useful because as you can see on the left in that example, it's a lot easier to tell the actual hierarchy of it, and the markup is very similar to the actual DOM. So when you're putting styles in, you can actually follow like what's a child and what's a parent. Modules, so for this one, you can actually break up your CSS using the app use role. So loading another module allows you to access the contents of that file. So you can use variables, mixins, and functions with a namespace based on the file name, which you can actually see an example of that at the bottom here. Mixins is a group of CSS declarations. So if you wanted to reuse a style, you could then import that into the file that you're using, and then you can actually pass in values to make them more flexible. The extend and inheritance, it lets you share the CSS properties from one selector to another. The actual example for this is on the next page because it's quite big. So you can see the difference it makes, even though there's a lot more code there, it's just easier to follow because they're using shared styles at the top. And then anything difference in its own little thing. So under success, you've got green border. For the operators, this one's quite useful for responsive. So if you want to make sure that it responds to like smaller devices, you can actually get it to calculate the width for you, and it can also be done on margin and other things. And that can actually work for dividing times, plus, and all the rest. So that's where all this has come from. That's their actual documentation link. Has anyone got any questions? We'll add this presentation into the code channel. Okay, thank you for listening.
Yeah, Laura, sorry. Yeah, I think it's just worth pointing out the reason we do this. Obviously, we've got a high number of apps, and we're trying to follow the same structure for this for CSS, so we don't get a lot of stray files around each component, where we could end up with hundreds of Sass files, basically just with one-line declarations in them, and repeat declarations. So we kind of followed this 7-to-1 structure from start, and it's stuck, and it's one of the most popular structures to use with Sass. If you go on the Sass guidelines, the link Laura's just shown, you can find 7-to-1 pattern on there, and you can also get the boilerplate from Git if you want to test it out and see kind of structure we follow. So it's all pretty straightforward, and hopefully anyone that goes between our apps can see why we do this and benefit it as. That's all I wanted to add.